There's a small back room on the second floor of my parents' house. They'd been using it as a storage room for years, and the mold had finally become too much of a problem to be ignored, so it would have to be gutted. They hired a family friend, Frank, who had offered to do the job at a discounted rate. I ended up being the only one at home that day, and he came over to start the renovations. I let him in, and he explained to me that he'd been pulling up the old tile and taking down the drywall. He warned me that it would probably be loud, but told me not to worry. I settled down on the couch downstairs and tried my best to tune out the sounds of tile being smashed and walls being ripped open. The noise stopped suddenly, and I heard Frank call for me. He sounded a little frightened, but I figured he just damaged something or injured himself, or something along those lines. I was not at all prepared for the actual reason he called me into that room. There, lying on its side, in the hollow space behind the wall, was a mummified corpse. It looked to be the body of a young boy, maybe around 5 or 6. He was curled up like he had been crying, with his head tucked into his knees and his arms wrapped around his legs. His skin seemed unnaturally smooth, and it had taken on a reddish-brown hue. He still had tufts of blonde hair stuck to his scalp. I don't know how long I stared at the body. It couldn't have been more than 5 minutes, but it felt like I would never be able to look away. I was snapped out of it by Frank, who shook me by the shoulders and told me to call the police. The rest of that day passed in a blur. I have vague memories of being questioned, and of the forensic personnel moving in and out of that small back room, but that's about it. I learned more details over the course of the following days. The space the body was found in had, at one time, been a small room, not even big enough to stand in. The walls, the floor, even the ceiling of the room were covered in deep, desperate scratches. The boy had actually been closer to 10, but his small frame, likely the result of malnutrition. His fingers were broken and twisted at odd angles, and the only other injuries they found were old and healed. My parents were briefly considered suspects, up until the medical examiner confirmed that the corpse was actually older than both of them. The police attempted to track down the original owners of the house, only to find they've both already passed. They managed to get a hold of their son, though. They won't tell me any more than that. Maybe that means he knows something. I started hearing the scratching about a week after the body was found. At first, it was only at night. It would start soft and slow, but then it would gradually grow louder and more frantic, to the point where I thought something might come through the wall. It didn't matter what room I was in. I didn't get much sleep, but I managed for a while by taking naps during the day. Eventually, the scratching became more constant. Any time that I was in my house, all I could hear was the terrible, desperate scratching of what sounded like dozens and dozens of hands. My parents finally took me to see a therapist after they found me on the floor of my bedroom, crying and screaming at the walls to stop, screaming that I couldn't help them, that I didn't know how. My therapist says they were auditory hallucinations brought on by trauma, and while I'm not sure if I really believe that, it's probably the best explanation that I'm going to get. I moved in with my partner about a month ago, and I don't hear the scratching anymore. I don't go over to my parents' house anymore either. They decided just to close that back room off and try to forget about it. I don't blame them, but I know if I ever bothered to look, I'd find more bodies behind those walls.